Howdy, Full Metal Cowboy Straight shooting a review of Star Wars Attack of the Clones, and I am continuing my series of Star Wars reviews leading up to Star Wars Episode 9, which does not have a title as I am filming this review. This is actually the third time I am reviewing Star Wars Attack of the Clones, much like how last month was the third time I reviewed The Phantom Menace. And the same will apply to Revenge of the Sith up to The Force Awakens, whereas the second timers are going to be The Last Jedi as well as the Clone Wars shows. As for first timers, Rebels and Solo. In my original series of Star Wars reviews, I did state that The Phantom Menace was my least favorite Star Wars film. Now, after reevaluating both The Phantom Menace as well as Attack of the Clones, my least favorite of the two is actually Attack of the Clones, and there's some reasons why. The Phantom Menace actually does look more appealing than Attack of the Clones, and that's because after 20 years, The Phantom Menace still has great location shooting, and it does have a great lightsaber duel, whereas Attack of the Clones has an overabundance of digital effects, and the duel at the end of Attack of the Clones really wasn't all that exciting. Although Yoda pulling out his lightsaber is something that I would call a guilty pleasure moment of mine. Yeah, sure. It's mostly because my favorite character in Star Wars Yoda is. Now, I am not totally against the use of digital effects in today's films. Terminator 2, great early example of using digital effects sparingly and when necessary. The Lord of the Rings The Two Towers, as well as The Lord of the Rings Return of the King, uses digital effects sparingly and only when necessary. And with Star Wars Attack of the Clones, George Lucas got carried away with the use of digital effects because there is an overabundance of it. And as a result of this, the prequel trilogy has a stark contrast to the original trilogy in regards to the visual effects. Because one of the great things about the Star Wars trilogy from 1977 to 1983 is that the effects were all practical. It made things look real. It made the galaxy of Star Wars feel like a living, breathing universe. Whereas with the prequel trilogy, as years have gone by, the effects don't feel as timeless as what the original trilogy offered. In short, Attack of the Clones has not aged well. There is, however, one good thing about Star Wars Attack of the Clones, and that is John Williams' score. I'd say this is one of his weakest scores to the Star Wars franchise, but at least it stands out as one of the stronger things about Star Wars Attack of the Clones compared to everything else. That and Ben Burtt's sound design, especially those seismic charges that you hear in the middle of the film, which actually still sound amazing for something that was made in 2002, even though it has not visually aged well. But what ultimately makes Attack of the Clones the weakest prequel in the Star Wars saga is the script as well as the direction, both by George Lucas. Not only did George Lucas get carried away with an overabundance of digital effects, he also wrote a script with illogical, nonsensical story beats. Especially the concept of Jedis being forbidden to love. And having seen Attack of the Clones numerous times like other Star Wars films, I picked up on something, although this is not a complaint because this was never touched upon in Attack of the Clones or any other Star Wars film. But Attack of the Clones shows Obi-Wan drinking some alcohol, and this is never touched upon for whatever reason because it's not that important. But I am led to assume, after seeing that it's okay for Jedi to drink booze, which would impair their senses, and they can't produce offspring so that the Jedi Order can continue throughout generations. George Lucas should have rewrote some parts of the script. I really mean it. Even if I was drinking some beer while watching Attack of the Clones all the way through, the one thing that would definitely sober me up quickly is the acting. Now that's a thing that will not dull the senses, because the acting is actually some of the worst in the entire Star Wars franchise. I was able to cut Jake Lloyd some slack for his performance because it wasn't his fault for why his performance was lacking in The Phantom Menace. But I cannot say the same for Hayden Christensen as Anakin, who I think is the worst Anakin actor I have seen in the entire franchise. And it's not just Hayden Christensen. Natalie Portman gave one of her worst performances I have ever seen throughout her career. Especially when she says, "I truly, deeply love you." God. But Attack of the Clones does have some stand-up performances. We have the late, great Christopher Lee as Count Dooku, who I think is a character that leaves a lot to be desired, but Christopher Lee's presence was worth watching Attack of the Clones. And Ewan McGregor was actually really good as Obi-Wan. I actually had no complaint with Ewan McGregor this time. Sure, Ewan McGregor was one of those actors that was plagued with a monotone delivery in acting thanks to George Lucas's direction in The Phantom Menace, but Ewan McGregor did improve since then, and this is actually one consistent theme from this point on for the prequel trilogy of Star Wars. Anakin Skywalker is the central character of the prequel trilogy of Star Wars, and with the existence of the original trilogy that came before it in production order, we all know that this character would later become Darth Vader, which is really painful to grasp given the backstory we get of Darth Vader in A New Hope, and it doesn't live up in Attack of the Clones. We never really thought of the idea that a whiny main protagonist would later become one of the most famous villains in the history of film. You want to know what else doesn't live up? The title. Usually the titles to a Star Wars film refers to something. A New Hope was referring to Luke. The Empire Strikes Back, that's self-explanatory. Return of the Jedi refers to Anakin. The Phantom Menace refers to the Sith. What about Attack of the Clones that refers to a certain action that the clones actually did? We see them being introduced. We see them fighting for the Jedi Order. There really isn't an attack from the clones that would explain the title. This title this film is... Now, Attack of the Clones definitely has its moments, especially regarding his mother and what happens to her, because there was a legitimately really frightening moment with Anakin Skywalker. It's just too bad they cut the really intense part really short. Even if Attack of the Clones had its moments, it's riddled with terrible dialogue. Again, thanks to the script. I mean, who cannot forget about Anakin complaining about the sand and how it's rough, coarse, and irritating. It gets everywhere. Even the delivery of that line is awful. Star Wars Attack of the Clones is a guilty pleasure of mine, alongside the remainder of the prequel trilogy of Star Wars. Not only is Star Wars Attack of the Clones the worst prequel in the Star Wars saga, in my opinion, it's also one of the worst Star Wars films ever made. Although it's not as bad as the Star Wars Holiday Special. Although that too is a guilty pleasure of mine. I'm going to be blasting a 4 out of 10 for Star Wars Attack of the Clones. Next time I jump into hyperspace into Star Wars, I'm going to be looking at both Clone Wars television shows. The microseries by Genndy Tartakovsky and the CG Clone Wars show that is actually having a new season this year. So until then, I'm going to be reloading for my next review, so until then, may the Force be with you.